Joining me today is Cynthia Moore, author of Dancing on Coals, a memoir of an overperformer. After 38 years of daily meditation practice, in addition to retreats, workshops, and studying with a variety of teachers, Cynthia Moore found the answer to her question, what is the point? Why do we do any of it? The answer came to her in a small church in Arezzo, Italy, but had been in her heart all along. We do what we love and we stay firmly planted in the present moment. That's all. That's enough. That's love. Endorsed by Whoopi Goldberg, she takes readers through wildly varied incarnations in the author's life that both impress and amuse, and sometimes makes us shudder. From her childhood in the Bahamas to finishing school in Switzerland, a theater career, including a turn as an award winning playwright, and becoming a therapist, we take a bumpy roller coaster ride until we ultimately land at her final phase happiness and peace with her husband, children, and most importantly, herself. She's worked as a mental health counselor for 23 years with a particular focus on the connection between spirituality and trauma. Welcome to the show, Cynthia. Nice to have you on.
Thank you, Kathryn. Great to be here.
Okay, well, Cynthia, 38 years, that's a long time. Do we, I'm thinking 38 years of meditation and retreats and workshops. Um, do we have to, does it have to take that long? I mean, because I know that question that I mentioned in the beginning that you say, well, like, what is the point? I mean, I think most of us, or many of us, or I'll include myself, you know, very often say, what's the point? Why are we doing all this? And I think, especially in this particular time, in this particular age in America today, right?
Yes.
So I don't think we have 38 years. So help us.
Well, the irony is that some people wake up on a park bench and they have an opening experience where they get what I got in that church in Arezzo instantaneously. And that's kind of the magic of it. But for some of us, we have to struggle and effort and strive and work and meditate until our knees hurt. And And I don't even know if that's all necessary, but sometimes it just takes that long to find your own way home.
You found your own way home and you had that connection because I am very impressed with Whoopi Goldberg. Okay. So how did you two get together and how did that affect your journey, I should say? Because you certainly affected hers.
I was in a theater group. I was in several theater groups when I was younger, and this was in the 70s and the 80s, and there was a very groundbreaking form of theater coming out of Poland, actually. A Polish director called Jerzy Grotowski invented this kind of theater called poor theater. And it was theater without lights, without costumes, without sets, but the actors were acrobatically trained, athletic, gymnastic. And the art form was the art of gesture, the art of expression, the art of the body. And we were touring with the California Arts Council up and down the state with one of our shows called Angel Window Devil Door. And it was a wild combination of physical movement and text and performance. And Whoopi was in San Diego at the time. She saw us perform and she said, I haven't seen anything like this. I want to be a part of this. And so she came back with us to Berkeley, where we lived, and she joined our theater company. And she's, as you know, incredible. We all did, shortly after that, we all did solo shows. So we each did a solo show in this little studio that we had. And she was discovered by Alice Waters, who wanted her for A Color Purple. And then shortly after that, Mike Nichols came in and said, I want to put your solo show on Broadway. And so it was a classic story of the young up and coming performer being discovered and whisked off to Broadway.
And you're talking about the physicality, I guess, because I think I mean, that's really, I think, important in terms of what you are doing and getting to the point where you got. I've noticed living in New York City, going to quite a few Broadway shows, there's a lot of acrobatics and physical kind of dance and
Mm.
movement, more so, I think, than there's ever been. So that kind of struck me when you mentioned that sort of the gymnastics. is important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In these
Yeah.
days, I would suppose it's coming more like hip hop, and some of that genre is infiltrating into Broadway. So it's coming back in a way, this gymnastic form. That's true.
So, okay, so right now, and now sort of fast forward, I guess, now you say, okay, so you've reached the point where, and you've been a therapist yourself, obviously, bumpy roller coaster, as I said. I said final phase. Now, what does that mean? The happiness and peace that you have with your husband and your children, this is your final phase. You're happy, you're content. Is that true?
I
And
think
that is
I
at the
think
end? Are we talking about?
let's hope not.
I know, because you got a lot more to, yeah, okay.
I got way more to go.
Yeah.
I think final phase just means when you reach a level of contentment, no matter what's happening. So, that's what I was striving for. I spent all those years striving for some form of external validation and approval, and kept thinking that would be the answer, that someone would say, okay, you're good enough, you've got it, you're doing enough. And then at a certain point, it became, well, actually, over those 38 years of meditation, it became clearer and clearer that it was a matter of how I hold what's happening in the world, what's happening to me, and how I respond to it. It's not so much about controlling what happens, it's about how you respond to it. And I found that ability to have equanimity, and even, I like to talk about the nervous system and the fact that we are pretty much constantly, chronically in a fight flight state of arousal as a country, and even I think globally at this moment in time. And so to be able to shift that to the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the state of ease and flow and contentment and peace, that seems to me to be the object, to figure out how to shift out of fight flight into ease and flow. And once you have that, you can have that response even when things are tough, even when things are challenging.
Okay. And things are always challenging. I think that's what I hear you saying. So you may be challenged by your husband, by your kids, or you can, you wake up in the morning and you look at the news, and
Yeah.
that's challenging. So can we just be really specific about, like, what do you do? Let's take, you open up your computer and you're looking at the news,
Mm.
national, international. How do you get into a calming phase or what?
I
Yeah,
could bottle
state.
that, I would be so rich.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's it.
But it is a matter of remembering that your state of mind, your state of presence, your state of being is more important than even what's happening in Washington, D.C., than even what's happening in the Middle East. That's the first priority, is to calm and breathe and be centered so that you can receive that troubling information without getting completely dysregulated and flying into fight, flight, and hysteria, which is not a place that we can resist from, which is not a place that we can fight from, which is not a place that we can be effective from. So if you can take a moment, okay, you asked me, how do I open the computer?
Yeah.
I meditate first. First thing in the morning.
Yeah.
I meditate so I come into my body, so I am present. I open the computer with a very clear sense of how much I can handle in that day, how much I want to ingest in terms of the stimuli that's coming from the media. And sometimes I have to close it again because I can only take so much in a given day. Now, this doesn't mean I'm not an activist. It doesn't mean I don't work on my own activity in response to what's happening, but I want to come from a place that is centered and calm and has that bigger picture, that bigger self way of looking at it, rather than the little self. As the Buddhists say, the bigger self is more expansive, more equanimous, more serene, and the little self gets easily frightened and easily hijacked.
So the bigger self may, just as you say, you take in so much, and and with what you're comfortable with, and then you close your computer. Do you eliminate noise that is gets in the way, kind of like focus more on what you want to listen to, what you want to, I'm being very specific, what you want to read, what newspapers you, what, whatever it is, but you do have some control. You do have control over that. You don't have to take it all in.
Definitely. And I'm very aware that certain media sources are marketing, peddling hysteria because that works, and other media sources seem to be a little bit more rationally inclined. And so I lean towards those media sources because I don't want to be jacked up into outrage, even though outrage is inevitable in some cases, but I want to be able to modulate how much I give into that and how much I'm manipulated by that.
Yeah. Outrage sells, like you said.
Yeah.
It's mark. Yeah. The other, yeah. And so you have to be aware of that, I guess. And then, as we just discussed, and then be able to control, mitigate some of that information that we get. Okay, that's the external world. Now, what about relationships? Let's say with a spouse, with children, because
Mm.
there's stuff that always happens and that's continuous. What do you do in those circumstances when the
Well,
uncomfortable? Yeah, go ahead.
one of the things that I cultivated as a therapist was a way to work with people with this Buddhist concept of the bigger self and the little self, which is to invite, people come in and they have their grievance or their problem or what they're struggling with, and if you think of that as the little self, you can really, it's very important to hear that and know how that is in your body and what the beliefs are about that and how you feel, how you behave when you're in thrall to the little self. And so in relationship with my family, of course, I'll get triggered. Something will come up and I name it to myself. Okay, there's the little self. She believes she's not loved. She's going through her thought process right now of, I just got ignored or neglected. And I try to bring compassion and kindness to that place in myself without entirely believing it, because I think of, the Buddhists talk about the mind. The mind comes up with all these stories and all these difficulties and all these dramas. And sure, we have those. They hurt. They still hurt, but we don't have to believe the content. And so more and more, I try to work on noticing when something gets triggered of, oh, there's that old belief system. There's that core wounding place that says I'm not loved or I'm separate. And I really try to bring compassion to that so that I can move through that into the bigger place.
Do
Does
you
that make
find,
sense?
yeah, that does make sense. And I'm thinking, and I'm going to say this, a woman of a certain age, do you think that that also helps as one ages and has all these experiences that you've been describing, that somehow you're able to perhaps engage in that the calming experience? It happens more easily than, say, when you're younger.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Carl Jung said that in the first half of life, uh, our goals are defined by our ego, by our striving, by our external needs and requirements. And in the second half of life, we become more attuned to our inner self, our soul, and that authentic place, the transcendent function, he called it. And I think that's absolutely true, that in the first half of life, I was flailing and striving and trying to get somewhere. And finally, I failed. It didn't work. And
And
so I had to look inwards and say, all right, what else is there? And I was lucky enough to change into a career where I could look inwards and I could say, all right, what do I really need to be in this life in a way that feels satisfying and content? And so I do agree that as we get older, we get a lot more practice and we don't care so much what people think, right? It's not
yeah,
so much about how we're perceived anymore.
yeah, I think that's key.
Yeah.
We don't care. That. it's not that we don't care, but it has less of an impact in terms of what other people, what they see in us, or we don't really care. We're more comfortable in ourselves. I think all of that begins to happen probably when you're 60. I'm putting a number on it. Maybe as you age, or when you're over 60. But so you've written a memoir about this. I think people writing memoirs, that's brave. I think the vulnerable, just showing the community, showing everyone that you're vulnerable and showing your own vulnerabilities. So how did you get to that point where you felt, okay, now I can write about all of this. I can write about me.
Mhm. You know, I needed to metabolize all of it. There are so many disparate parts to my life. I needed to figure out how to metabolize what the through line, what the center line was. And I'm a great fan of Annie Lamott, who writes so vulnerably and yet so humorously about her life and her vulnerabilities. So I wanted to try to make fun of my pain. I started out going, I'm going to write about my pain and my struggles in a way that's humorous. And in fact, my first editor said, you have to be more vulnerable. There's no vulnerability in this. And it took me years to figure out what that meant. What does it even mean to be vulnerable? It took me years to learn how to listen to myself in a vulnerable way. So that was kind of the curriculum almost of writing this book is how do I share these really tender wounded places in a way that's not indulgent, that's not over dramatic, but that is possibly can enable younger women to relate and to learn from some of it.
And so when you finished the book, how did you feel?
Unfinished.
Yeah.
I probably finished it about 20 times.
Yeah.
I wrote it maybe 25 years ago. My kids were little, my kids are grown now. And I kept coming back to it with that instruction from the editor of find more vulnerability. I kept coming back and kind of aerating, excavating, digging, trying to dig holes in it to bring up some of the vulnerability. So that was an ongoing process for maybe 15 years. And then I think recently I got to a point where, okay, I think I think I've said what I want to say with this book. And that was delightful. That part was a feeling of being complete, and that part was delightful.
Was it delightful for the editor, or were you with the same editor after 15 years, or were they gone? um, uh,
They're pretty much gone. That was a
yeah.
one-time deal, but I'm working with She Writes Press, and Brooke Warner, who's the editor of She Writes Press, is just wonderful. She's such a gift to the publishing world. And so yeah, she accepted the book right away, and I was delighted to be able to work with them.
And the question also, this is one that I do always ask when one has written a memoir, because you're talking about obviously people in your life and exposing them as well, husband, wife, children, family, other family. How did that work for you?
Well, it's not published yet. It comes out next week, so
Uh-huh.
yet to find out how that works for other people.
Well, maybe I should say, how much do they know? Like your kids, your husband,
Uh,
if they,
my kids and my husband have read it, so I don't think there's any trouble on that front. I do know that some of my friends have completely different recollections of some of the scenes that I depict. We're in our 70s. Our memories are not that great.
right, which
So
is
I'm
good
just
and bad, right?
good and bad.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
Everybody has
just
their own story, or they see it very differently. I think that's very common, right?
absolutely. Its memory is subjective.
Yeah.
So I like to say it's the flavor of the scene, it's the flavor of the relationship rather than the exact conversation we may have had on a particular Tuesday.
Yeah. Do you have siblings?
I have a lot of siblings. Yes, I have five sisters and one brother.
Well, do you find with your siblings that the same incident that happened in your household and everybody was there, everybody has a different story to tell, or they felt it or saw it very differently?
Absolutely. My siblings are we cross a span of about 15 years, no, even more when you consider the younger ones, 20, 25 years. There's a whole span. And so you could almost do a movie from each person's perspective, and it would be an entirely different movie because there was divorce, there was moving, there was all kinds of upheaval. So yeah, it's a very disparate group, but there is a lot of love and camaraderie between all of us.
That's a Woody Allen movie, I think. That's what it sounds like to me. Or it's your film, maybe next, right? The memoir, put it into a film.
Maybe next. That would be great.
Yeah. So you did go through a lot. I mean, we don't have to go through all of it, obviously, but you had start with the drunken parents and the effect that had on you and also on your siblings. Um,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, it was hard growing up with that. There was a lot of verbal abuse and shouting and violence, verbal violence, not physical violence. And yeah, it was traumatizing. I actually slept in the linen closet because that was the safe place in my home. And to this day, I'm grateful for the linen closet. But yeah, they were very challenged and they were struggling with a lot of emotional issues themselves. And so they sent me off early on to boarding school. And that was sort of the beginning of my rootlessness. How do I go home? I wanted to go home. I begged my mother to bring me home when I was 11, and she refused. And so I spent the rest of my life trying to find a way to get home.
Well, what do you think if you had stayed? I mean, it's sort of hard to, I don't know, still have to ask this question, but I'm thinking like, what if you had stayed home, not gone to boarding school, and sort
Mm,
of endured all of what was happening, the chaos and everything else that all the negative stuff that's the verbal abuse.
mm.
What do you think? I mean,
Worse, much worse.
worse. Yeah.
Yeah, I've actually never considered that question, Catherine. That's a great question. Yeah, it would have been much worse because they were getting worse, and the time I did spend with them was getting more and more challenging emotionally. So you're right, that would have been a worse outcome. In a way, it was a blessing. I had to learn to be self-sufficient. And there's a scene in the book where I'm 11 and I'm in this boarding school and I'm begging my mother to bring me home, and she says, absolutely not. And something slammed shut in me in that moment. It was like a steel gate that said, okay, all right, I'm done. I'm done trying. I'm done looking to you for my answers. And while in psychology, you could say that was a form of splitting or disintegration, in a way, it was also a blessing because it made me turn to myself and focus on what I could do to provide what I needed. And so it was a very interesting moment. I remember it vividly, the sense of, I don't need you anymore.
Yeah. And maybe on some level, she knew that.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think she did. I think she did. I think she did the best she could.
Could. Yeah.
Yeah, she couldn't do any better. She was struggling with her own difficulties. So I don't blame her for that. It was just a hard row for all of us.
Right. Well, so the book has not come out. We have a couple minutes left. The book is, what's the date for the when the book comes out?
The book will come out March 25th. There is also an audiobook available. It's available for pre-order now. You can order it from your local bookstore, from Barnes and Noble, or Amazon if you're using Amazon. And yeah, let me give you my website also if
Okay.
anyone wants to reach out to me. I'm at Cynthia Moore Writes at gmail.com.
And still practicing therapy?
I am mostly retired. I have a handful of people that I work with in mostly for tune-ups and self-improvement modalities rather than trauma and childhood repair modalities. But I love the work, so I can't quite stop.
And yeah, well, everybody, I think anyway, including myself, everybody needs a tune up.
Yeah,
Yeah, every once in
absolutely.
a while. And
Absolutely.
yeah, so great talking to you today. And Cynthia Moore is the author of Dancing on Coals, a memoir of an over performer. Great show. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn.